Well, in case you haven't guessed, I'm Tom Semioli, and I am defending the 1980s. And I'm going to save the usual intro for last because we really need to get into it. This episode is on Miles Davis in the 1980s. To our Miles Davis devotees, we will see that even though Miles might not have been as innovative and groundbreaking as he was in the 1950s through 1970s, he remained an artist to be reckoned with and made amazing music, which has been mostly ignored until now. Of course, Miles' influence on jazz, hip hop, rock, experimental, popular music is incalculable, and his influence is still felt well into the 21st century. Yet, few artists have been as unfairly maligned by the jazz establishment than Miles Davis in the 1980s. You go figure, ignorance, conceit, self importance. And I really need to name names here, folks, because we need to set the record straight. I specifically want to call out Ken Burns for his atrocious jazz documentary series, which really should have been titled What Wynton Marsalis Thinks Jazz Should Be. Secondly, I call out Wynton Marsalis, who has institutionalized jazz. He's set jazz back 100 years to men in suits playing standards. Wynton, you've done more harm to the art form than the artist you so roundly criticize. And, Marsalis and Burns dismissed experimental and jazz fusion music in their documentary. A poor term, I agree, but we have to call it something, call it anything. This really did a great disservice to the artist, which influenced David and my generation, and who continue to do so. So it's important to really point these things out. People like this are tools of the establishment, and sadly, their opinions are taken as gospel, and of course by the establishment media, which suppresses art that challenges the status quo. Incidentally, if Ken and Wynton are watching or listening to this podcast, don't forget tune into tune into Notes from an Artist every Monday night at 8 p.m. on Cygnus Radio, www.cygnus.com, and subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and Buzzsprout, and do subscribe to our YouTube page. Still got to call somebody out again. Thirdly, posthumously, the late Stanley Grouch, who flayed Miles in the media for his forays into rock, funk, and experimental. There is a must-see video, which I link below in the YouTube descriptive, of Miles Davis percussionist Matume debating Stanley Grouch in the 1990s. Again, you have to see that. Matume was in Miles Davis's 70s band. And he really puts Grouch to shame there. Again, it's important to call these people out because their opinions are in the history books. But now on digital media, we're correcting those errors. And kudos to all the indie journalists and musicians who are doing great work. Let me call out Rick Beato, Paul Thompson, PD Bass, Steve Ogello, and John Misek, who do a great 80s show. Their podcast, do listen to them. From the day he put a trumpet into his lips until he took his last breath, Miles Davis was a threat to the establishment. Jazz really has yet to recover from Miles' passing in 1991, and from the damage done by the aforementioned jazz police, the chiefs of the jazz police. Miles came out of retirement after a 5-year period of inactivity in the early 80s, from 75 to 80, due to the effects of substance abuse and the fact that he really worked himself to death. And again, one more call out. This period of Miles Davis' life was glorified in a horrific film entitled Miles Ahead, which was starred Don Cheadle, and he directed it. And it came out in 2015. And all the great music Miles made, and Don Cheadle chose to highlight his drug addiction. Nice move there, Don. But let's talk Miles. Let's talk music in the 80s. Miles' first album of the 80s was Man with the Horn. This is a great album to kick off the 80s for Miles. Came out in 1981, of course. Downbeat gave it a lukewarm review. Miles' longtime collaborator and producer Tio Macero is behind the desk there. Of course, Tio from Kinda Blue, Bitches Brew. Tio had a very Beatles-like approach to making records like George Martin and Jeff Emmerich. He edited tapes. He created loops. Remember, up until Miles, and Tio, jazz was simply live performances recorded in the studio, and Miles and Tio changed all that. So that alone is incalculable, for lack of a repeated adjective. These sessions commenced in June of 1980. He had two groups of musicians. One was Chicago-based, one was New York-based. The Chicago Cats were Robert Irving on keyboards, Randy Hall on keyboards, Felton Cruz was the bass player, electric bass, of course, and Vince Wilburn Jr. on drums. In New York City, you had Bill Evans on soprano sax. You had guitarist Mike Stern and Barry Finnerty, who were everywhere in the 1980s. Marcus Miller on electric bass, Al Foster on drums, and Sammy Figueroa was the percussionist. Great about this record is Miles returns to his signature muted tone, his signature sound, but he's still in rough shape after his long layoff. But there are great tracks on this record: Fat Time, Backseat Betty, Ada, featuring themes that he would return to for the remainder of his life. And note that all these tracks quote earlier Davis works. A lot of critics say that Miles forgot his past. They're simply wrong. Miles paid homage to his past and to jazz's past. He just did it with a modern aesthetic. And Miles always quotes bebop, Birth of the Cool, his 60s electric years all the time, especially beginning with this record. And of course, Miles is aware of Rick James and Sister Sledge and Kool and the Gang, and he always said that he wanted to reach as many people as possible through his music, and that's what he's doing on this album. Miles has his finger on the pulse of what's happening in music, in fashion, and his 80s work throughout reflects that, and Men with the Horn is a good record. Check it out. 1982, Miles releases the album We Want Miles. It's a live record. Let's look in the gatefold. We see Marcus and Miles yucking it up there. This album was recorded in the spring of 1981. Miles' first concert tour in 6 years. Tour garnered massive attention. The band consists of Mike Stern, Bill Evans, Marcus Miller, Al Foster, Minu Sunulu, who Miles discovered at McKell's, the famous New York jazz club. The tracks were recorded at the Kicks Club in Boston, Avery Fisher in New York City, and a couple of Japanese dates. From Man with the Horn, we hear Backseat Betty, plus two versions of a great track, Jean-Pierre, a long version and a short version, and another theme that Miles would return to throughout the remainder of his life. Miles reaches back to render an updated version of My Man's Gone, and a great track name for the Boston Kicks Club. This album won the 1982 Grammy Award for Best Jazz Instrumental Performance by a Soloist. Now, the title, We Want Miles, was spoofed by critics and reviews because Miles wasn't blowing enough for them. Wake up. That was never Miles Davis's style. He was a compositional player. You don't transcribe a Miles Davis solo. He was not like a Charlie Parker or a John Coltrane. It's amazing that journalists would say such a thing. And, if you want to relate it to rock players, think of guitar players, Johnny Marr, George Harrison, Mick Ronson. Their solos were part of the song. And Miles' trumpet was like a paintbrush. He was not a technical player. It was all about tone, phrasing, melody, emotion. How could you miss that? How many musicians do you recognize in one note? Frank Sinatra, Billie Holiday, Tony Bennett, Toots Thielemans, Tina Turner, Carlos Santana. Miles played one note. That's Miles Davis. So again, a great live record. Do check that one out. The next two records came out in 83 and 84. Remember, artists made a record a year. They were Star People. There you go. Star People, Miles' illustration on the cover there. And Decoy came out in 1984. Miles looking a bit sinister there. You have guitarist John Schofield on board. The bass chairs Marcus Miller and Darryl Jones. Of course, you know Darryl Jones as the Munch from his long association with the Rolling Stones, along with Sting and Steps Ahead. Both these albums combine live and studio tracks. I hear these as almost like James Brown vamp albums. The songs were merely blueprints for Miles' stage performances. And, Miles joked that he only made records to make money. I saw Miles in this period, and as always, he expanded on the templates of his studio recordings, much like, again, to make rock comparisons, Bob Dylan or the Grateful Dead. Miles Davis was not a jukebox, although that's what audiences are used to in America, I guess. The playings on this album are really extraordinary. You can tell Miles was listening to Herbie Hancock's Rocket, which was a big hit, and he was doing similar vamps in that style, which was appropriate for the 1980s. 1985, the record is You're Under Arrest. I love that cover. There's Miles with his weapon there. This album got lots of attention as Miles covered Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time and Michael Jackson's Human Nature. And the critics went apeshit. Why do critics go apeshit? Because they're monkeys, and monkeys make apeshit. Miles always did jazz renditions of contemporary hits. What were they complaining about? Come on, go back. Someday my prince will come. Autumn leaves. All of you. Bye bye Blackbird. This is a very good record. John McLaughlin appears for the first time with Miles since On the Corner in 1972. Kenny Garrett joins the band. Sting makes a very funny cameo appearance, spoken word. He reads the Miranda warning in French over the track One Phone Call, which is Miles' sly commentary on racial injustice and the police harassment that he endured his whole life in New York City. It's a fun record. He recycles and remodels many of the motifs you hear on Jack Johnson and Man with the Horn and other Electric albums. Very, very clever. Miles was having fun on this album. My goodness. Can an artist have fun? Can a jazz musician have fun? The Jazz Police wanted to arrest Miles for this album. It's an entertaining record. It's of its time because it was made in its time. A great cover photo. Again, Miles' artwork in the gatefold. There you go. Cool record. You're under arrest. Now we're going to get to some important stuff. Tutu, 1986. This is a bona fide Miles masterpiece. Named for the great South African anti-apartheid human rights activist Bishop Desmond Tutu. This album won a Grammy Award for Best Jazz Performance. At the time of this album, Miles was hanging out with Prince, and he may have recorded some tracks with Prince. We don't know. None have surfaced to my knowledge. The album is mostly composed by bassist Marcus Miller. There is one George Duke tune, Backyard Ritual, great tune. Miles also covers Scritti Politti, Perfect Way. And again, Miles was listening to what was going on. He was listening to the British New Romantics. This is Miles' first album on Warner Brothers after 4 decades with Columbia. It's produced by Marcus Miller and Tommy LaPuma. Now, you know Tommy LaPuma made big records with George Benson, Anita Baker, Al Jarreau, Paul McCartney, Michael Franks, Diana Krall, Babs Streisand, the Crusaders. He's a very contemporary cat. And the cover won a Grammy for packaging, the cover shot by the great Irving Penn. There's Miles looking a little stressed out there. Interesting blend of funk, R&B, reggae, very heavy on keyboards, bass, and drums. You have Omar Hakim, Marcus, of course. George Duke featured prominently, as our keyboardists Jason Miles, Adam Holtzman, Bernard Wright. And of course, the critics went apeshit. Why? You know why. New York Times, Jazz Times, Downbeat, Village Voice all panned this record. How wrong they were. This is really one of Miles' great recordings. You know, when you talk kind of blues, Sketches of Spain, Bitches Brew, I think Tutu stands among them as one of Miles' great recordings. And to prove me right, check out Marcus Miller in 2010. He did a record and a tour entitled Tutu Revisited. And you can see that on YouTube. I know there's a live album and a DVD. Again, Miles is ruffling the establishment feathers. He's naming an album after a very controversial figure and delving into contemporary R&B and funk. And how dare a jazz artist do this? Come on, can't you put on a suit like Wynton? There is a great video from Tutu, which I will post in the descriptive. Check it out. Essential Miles Davis. I don't care what generation of fan you are of Miles Davis. Now, in 1987, Marcus Miller and Miles do a soundtrack album. It's a collaborative album. The obscure movie is entitled Siesta. There's the artwork. I can't find my CD, so I'll have to use the Spotify version. The film is directed by Mary Lambert. It stars Ellen Barkin, Gabriel Byrne, Isabella Rossellini, Martin Sheen. You can't go wrong with Martin Sheen. And British comic Alexei Sayle, whom I dig. Marcus plays most of the instruments. I think Miles is more or less a session player on this, but I guess the Miles Davis name on the cover certainly helps sales. A few brief appearances by Earl Klugh and John Scofield and Omar Hakim. Interesting, this album is dedicated to arranger Gil Evans, and who you know from Miles' Sketches of Spain and Porgy and Bess, among others. You hear Gil's influence on Marcus here, and you hear it in subsequent Marcus Miller albums as well. 1989, a near masterpiece, perhaps, Amandala. And there is the cover art to Amandala. I thought originally that this was a play on the name Nelson Mandela, but actually it's a South African term for the word power. And you see Miles' portrait on there on the map of Africa. This amazing cover was by Joe Gelbard, who was Miles' companion at the time, and I think till the end of his life. There's Miles looking fashionable on the back cover there with his hair addition. Marcus Miller is the main composer on this record. The keyboards are George Duke, Joey DeFrancesco, Jason Miles, Joe Sample. Foley comes along and plays some piccolo bass. The drum chair is Omar Hakim, Al Foster, Kenny Garrett is on sax, Don Elias and Minu Sunulu on percussion. Great tribute to Jocko, entitled Mr. Pastorius, who passed in 1987. Lots of African and Latin American rhythms and French themes. It's really an extension of Tutu in many ways. It's a true gem in the Miles catalog. You see Miles dipping his toes into world music. A very, very important album. Miles' last album of the 1980s is Aura. And again, I can't find my copy, so we'll have to use the Spotify version there. This was released by Columbia Records in '89, but it was recorded in 1985 when Miles was still under contract to CBS. The album is produced and composed by Peter Mikkelborg, who is a Danish composer, arranger, and record producer. And again, we see another Miles collaborator who is profoundly inspired by Gil Evans. Aura is a 10-part suite of orchestrations with contributions from John McLaughlin on guitar and bassist Nels Henning Orsted Peterson. They are really up in the mix. It's great to hear them. The compositions are named for the color spectrum, and supposedly that was the aura that Miles Davis gave off, according to its composer. Great meld of classical music, impressionism, European new music, jazz, rock, electronic. I really need to delve into this album more. It actually got favorable reviews in the press, perhaps because it echoed Miles' work with Gil Evans, and jazz critics were on familiar ground. It's not a very commercial record, and maybe that's why they liked it. Now, Columbia has been rife with Miles Davis archival releases, including those from the 80s. Now, Miles would have been furious, according to Tio Masro. He didn't like when Columbia raided the vaults, and that's what the Don Cheadle movie was about, really. But there are some good live albums you should check out. One of them I have here on CD, Miles Around the World. This came out in the 1990s. Bassist Benny Reitfeld is on this record, and you know Benny from our show. He is a friend of the show. Check out his interviews on our podcast and on our video page. He was in Miles' last Electric Band, 89, 90, 91. He's on this record. Another great record, archival release, is What It Is, recorded in Montreal in 1983. There's Miles with his Goopaline on there. That's a good one to check out. There's another one, Mercé Miles. I think that was 1990. I think Benny's on that one, so you want to check that one out. A lot of Miles' 80s compositions on that one. And the best of them all, really, I think, is That's What Happened, 1982 to 1985, the bootleg series, kind of like the Dylan bootleg series. So really, really great stuff to check out, archival releases of Miles Davis in the 1980s. The 1980s with Miles, I look at this as a decade that it was really a victory lap for him and all that he accomplished in the 50s and the 70s. You look at all the players in his bands, they were all young lions. Many went on to become prominent jazz band leaders and recorded artists in their own right. The Jazz Police had it out for Miles. They still do. I guess if the Jazz Police are chasing you, you are doing the right thing. But the music speaks for itself. You don't need anyone to tell you about it, except me, of course. If you haven't explored Miles in the 80s, do so. Last but not least, you really want to read a great book, The Last Miles, by George Cull. Really, really great work here. It's interviews with the players in the room who work with Miles. It's not some critic's assessment of what Miles Davis should have been or what he was. But in brief summary, certainly the albums you need to hear: Man with the Horn, We Want Miles, Tutu, Amandala, and Aura. 5 amazing records. And 4 albums you should really check out too: You're Under Arrest, Siesta, Decoy, and Star People. I mean, that's 9 albums in the 1980s that Miles did, not counting the archival releases. It was a spectacular decade for Miles Dewey Davis. And in the 1990s, he was still moving forward. I don't know if he was alive when this record came out, Doo-Bop, which he did with Easy Mo Bee. Who knows where Miles would have taken jazz? We all know how much the art form misses him. So my name is Tom Semioli. I approve of this message. That intro you heard was David C. Gross, my dear friend and Notes from an Artist radio partner. The name of the record is Theorcalist. You can check it out on Spotify and all the streaming services. This is a video and podcast is based on my op-ed on Know Your Bass Player, the 1980s rock's greatest decade. You can check it out. I've included a link below. Why am I qualified to do this? Well, I was a working musician in the 1980s, specifically a bass player. There's my working musician bass, the Steinberger XL. Best bass ever designed by Ned Steinberger. Sorry, Leo Fender. Sorry, Roger Sadowski. I also worked in the music biz. I worked in media for 20 years as a publicist. I worked in television. Don't hold that against me. But if you have any opinions, you have anything you'd like to add, please do so. Be respectful or be disrespectful if you are so inclined. Once again, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching Notes from an Artist. We'll see you again defending the 1980s.